This, the 18th letter, is all about sex, love, infatuation, and marriage, and how the devils distort God's intentions for human sexuality, and how they use it to further get us into their clutches.
Even under Slub-Glob, you must have learned at college the routine technique of sexual temptation, and since for us spirits this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, though necessary as part of our training, I will pass it over. But on the larger issues involved, I think that you have a good deal to learn.
There is obviously some animosity between Screwtape and Slub-Glob, the head of the Tempter's training college. Screwtape's feelings are again obvious in the opening of this letter. Apparently it is part of the curriculum at the Tempter's college to cover the techniques of sexual temptation. It's funny that the devils find tedious what we humans find so fascinating. Then Screwtape summarizes the simple choice that God offers human beings when it comes to sex.
The enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Ever since our fathers' first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. The latter, for the last few centuries, we have been closing up as a way of escape. We have done this through the poets and novelists by persuading the humans that a curious, and usually short-lived, experience which they call being in love is the only respectable ground for marriage. That marriage can, and ought to, render this excitement permanent, and that a marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. This idea is our parody of an idea that came from the enemy.
You see what the devils have done to marriage in our culture? They've convinced us that being in love is the most important thing about getting married. It's now the whole and only reason we get married. They've gotten us to expect that that feeling, being in love, is supposed to last forever, which is of course ridiculous. And they've gotten us to fully accept that if we are no longer in love, or in love with somebody else, well then the marriage can legitimately be terminated. It's in all the books and it's in all the movies. And people nowadays really believe it. Even Christians. Are you ready for another one of my all-time favorite quotes from the whole book?
The whole philosophy of hell rests on the recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another thing, and specifically that one self is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. A self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition.
That's the whole philosophy of hell right there. I love the simplicity of it. Existence is competition with others to the point of consuming them, or being consumed. You can see this philosophy all over the place. It's there on a societal level, and it can be a part of our personal relationships. If you are honest with yourself, you see this tendency in your own life to one degree or another. The philosophy of heaven is, of course, the opposite.
Now the enemy's philosophy is nothing more or less than one continual attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at a contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love, and this same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does, and even all he is, or claims to be.
The philosophy of heaven is grounded in love, which Screwtape calls an impossibility. He just can't fathom the idea of giving of oneself for another, without being motivated by hopes for a greater gain than the sacrifice. But love has this non-rational math to it. The more you give of yourself without looking for something in return, the more you get in return. But if you look for that return, then you won't get it. We experience this when we volunteer to clean up a park, or we make a special birthday present for someone, or just give up the argument without the win. 1 Corinthians 13 says it better than anything I could say. As subjects to King Jesus, the philosophy of love is to define all of our relationships. The devils can't understand love. But Screwtape does understand that it's behind everything. He continues.
Thus he is not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. At the other end of the scale, he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate.
So God is three in one, a community, a cooperation unto himself. Just as in the spiritual, this interconnectedness is built into the physical creation as well. All physical organisms are comprised of interdependent parts that exist in cooperation. The devils obviously hate all this. as it runs contrary to the whole philosophy of hell. So what does all this have to do with sex? Screwtape continues.
His real motive for fixing on sex as the method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker, as it is indeed among the spiders, where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire.
The physical act of sex is meant to be, it is designed to be, one of those situations in which you give, and somehow, if you aren't looking for it, gain at the same time, as is always the case when love is at the center of things. The family, the natural result of sex, is designed in a similar way.
He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents, and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse. For the members are more distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love.
And now comes the joke. Those are Screwtape's words. For him, it isn't very funny.
Now comes the joke. The enemy described a married couple as one flesh. He did not say a happily married couple, or a couple who married because they were in love, but you can make the humans ignore that. You can also make them forget that the man they called Paul did not confine it to married couples. Mere copulation for him makes one flesh. You can thus get the humans to accept as rhetorical eulogies of being in love what were in fact plain descriptions of the real significance of sexual intercourse.
In our culture, we think of marriage in a variety of ways. Usually that it has something to do with happiness or being in love. But God's description of marriage is quite different. He describes marriage as being one flesh. But it's not just married couples that become one flesh. The Apostle Paul says two will become one flesh even if they aren't married. It's the sexual act that does it, no matter who it's with.
The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured.
Some people accuse Christians of being prudes when it comes to sex, but that's not it at all. It's just that Christians take sex very seriously. A permanent bond is formed with the other. We aren't just saying that this is so. Sex was designed so that it would be so. That's the reason we take it seriously. And there's more. Christians don't separate sex from affection and family, which is another reason why they take sex so seriously that they link it to marriage.
From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce, affection and the family, humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy.
Sex was designed to produce affection and family. Because this is so, the devils have been able to take the affection bit and twist it and isolate it, and then get us to believe that being in love is the basis for marriage. The only one. We said it before, but that's the mechanism.
The error is easy to produce, because being in love does very often, in Western Europe, precede marriages which are made in obedience to the enemy's designs. That is, with the intention of fidelity, fertility, and goodwill. Just as religious emotion very often, but not always, attends conversion. In other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something the enemy really promises as its result.
Screwtape explains to Wormwood that it isn't very hard to convince human beings that being in love is the point of marriage. The reason it isn't very hard to do is that this idea is a distortion of what we will actually find in marriage, as it's designed by heaven, as a relationship based on selflessness instead of selfishness. Once this is achieved,
two advantages follow. In the first place, humans who have not the gift of continence can be deterred from seeking marriage as a solution because they do not find themselves in love. And, thanks to us, the idea of marrying with any other motive seems to them low and cynical. Yes, they think that. They regard the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life as something lower than a storm of emotion.
One advantage of convincing us that being in love, aka a storm of emotion, is the only acceptable basis for a marriage is that a lot of people won't get married for the reasons for which marriage was designed. I'll repeat those. Loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life. And there's another advantage for the devils to push this being in love thing.
In the second place, any sexual infatuation whatever so long as it intends marriage, will be regarded as love, and love will be held to excuse a man from all the guilt and to protect him from all the consequences of marrying a heathen, a fool, or a wanton. But more of this in my next. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
What we call being in love should actually better be described as infatuation. And what delights the devils is when we use this idea of being in love to justify marrying somebody that we shouldn't, or justifying walking away from a marriage that we're already in. Thank you, and we'll see you with letter number 19.